All right, friends, it's good to see you all this evening to be able to talk about some of the really, I think, interesting tools that are out there now for us as preachers or those who preach occasionally, whether it's in your pulpit every week, or perhaps you're filling in while your pastor's away, or you don't have a pastor and you're preaching. I think it would be important for us to recognize that AI has really been a game changer for some in terms of the writing sermon process. And I'm going to spend some time this evening talking about some of my ideas of how I view AI and sermon writing, and how we can do so faithfully with AI still being this ever evolving tool. And share some tools that I've developed as well that I'll share with you all in an email afterwards. And this will also be available on the e-learning portal of the Presbytery website also. As we go through, if there's things that pop up for you, feel free to type a question in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you, and we could have a question and I'll try my best to answer. But otherwise, it's good to spend some time with you this evening to talk about sermon writing and AI, or artificial intelligence. Just a short little overview of some of the things I think we're going to cover this evening, try to hit on. We're going to just do a very brief overview of what I mean, at least when I'm talking about AI. And then for the purposes of tonight, we're talking mostly about ChatGPT, OpenAI's program for ChatGPT. If you want to go more in depth, Susan DeGeorge and I went more in depth of what we talk about when we talk about AI, when we talked about the Polity tool we developed for the Presbytery. But I'm just going to do a brief overview tonight, just so we all are using the same language. We're going to look at some of the tools I've worked on developing for ChatGPT to help you in your sermon writing process. And I will keep emphasizing tool. It's not going to replace writing sermons for you, but it's meant to hopefully alleviate for you perhaps some of the stressful pieces of sermon writing that you don't find life-giving. So perhaps, if you're able to use this tool, it might free up more time for you to invest in the parts of the sermon writing process that really energize you. And so that's something we're going to be focusing on this evening. And we're also going to take a moment to consider and ask some ethical questions around the boundaries and the usage of AI in sermon writing. I do not believe, I'll maybe get a little bit ahead of myself on that and say, since AI is this ever evolving thing and it seems to keep changing day to day, I think how we think about the ethical use of AI is going to be something that has to keep evolving. But we'll take some time at the end to just ask ourselves some questions about the ethical use of AI in sermon writing as well. So I want to just talk briefly, as I said, about an overview of AI, just so we're on the same page. As I said, we're using ChatGPT this evening, which is a large language model. This is a type of AI out of the many different types there are out there. Part of what makes large language models unique, like ChatGPT, is that they're trained on a wide array of data. Again, raising ethical questions, we could ask questions about what they've been trained on. But for the purposes of how we interface with it and the results that they produce, these models are trained on an immense amount of data, and they use very complex algorithms to help try to create answers or formulate responses that mimic our natural language patterns. And they're useful, I think, as we'll see, in accomplishing or addressing a wide range of tasks, especially when it comes to sermon writing. So that's mainly what I mean when I'm talking about AI this evening, is large language models like ChatGPT. If you want to really dive into how platforms like ChatGPT learn, there's a link to this video in the PowerPoint. There's a great little short video, though, about how AIs like ChatGPT learn. Just a helpful, perhaps, video to help you better understand this complex and ever-evolving tool. So I don't know how much about AI You all know, perhaps you've heard about ChatGPT, and perhaps, well, if you're Presbyterian, you might like to know that the GPT stands for something. It's not just a random collection of words. So chat in ChatGPT stands for how we interface with the AI. There's a text interface, and you could type to it, and it gives you text back. The G stands for generative. It generates new content and ideas from information that it receives, what you put into it. It also, the P stands for pre-training. So it refers to how it's learned, what it's been trained on, what it continues to learn, and interpreting that in relationship to what the user is asking it to do. And that then leads to the T, which is a transformer. It predicts what it is you want it to do to make this new thing that you're asking it to do. I think a great example for ChatGPT is something like if you put in the sky is blue, the sky is a large language model based on its training is going to use its algorithms to guess with a certain amount of certainty that blue is probably the word that you would want to come next. So it would, if you put in the sky is, it would, based on all its training, guess that blue is the word that you're looking for. And I say this because as we look at these tools tonight for ChatGPT and sermon writing and how you look at using this as a sermon writing tool, I want to really emphasize that the quality of the output is really dependent on what you put in. So if you feed it very little, it will give you very little. If you give it a low effort input, it will give you low effort output. Because if we're thinking about it, the more that you put into it, the more that it is more accurately able to guess or try to generate the kind of content that you want it to generate. But if you give it some vague answer, it's not going to be able to fully able to assess what it is you're trying to do. And I really touch on that as for Polity Pal as well. The kind of question that you ask it, it's dependent on the quality of your question. So let's spend some time. Oh, Angela, sorry. I see your hand.
I'm sorry. I'm Casey. I'm just because I'm really a newbie at this.
Yeah.
So I hear all these things, Chat GPT. I don't even know what Gemini and are those other types of AI. And is Chat GPT free? Is it something you have to subscribe to? Like, I don't know what are the differences in the other things?
Those are all great questions. So, I mean, I think based on my own experiences, some of the different AI models out there like Gemini, made by Google, I think Gemini is really great if you're asking it to do like video or photo content generation. And I wonder why that is, since Google owns YouTube. Whereas ChatGPT, in my personal experience, has been really good for the kind of things that we're going to be looking at tonight. And in terms of whether it's free or the price of it, that's something we'll touch on a little bit. ChatGPT is free if you want to use it, the basic ones, or if you want to use some of the models that I'm sharing. But as I'll go a little bit deeper into tonight, if you wanted to create your own, for example, then you would need to buy a subscription.
Create your own? What do you mean? Like buy AI?
Yeah, if you wanted to create your program like the kind that I'm going to show you, you would be able to do that, but it requires a subscription.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, though. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ChatGPT or the GPTs that I've created for sermon writing, and perhaps ways that you could use them if you're preaching on a regular basis, or again, if you're preaching on occasion. So I would say as we look at some of these tools, perhaps some may be more interest to you than others. And if you have suggestions for ones at the end, I'm happy to try and spend some time playing around and creating something that can be shared. I will say one of the things that I'll preempt this at the top. When we look at these different tools for sermon writing with ChatGPT, one of the things that I've tried to limit in how it responds to you is giving you exact quotations or references to theologians or historical figures. My experience with ChatGPT, even in its latest iteration of ChatGPT 5, is that it sometimes likes to hallucinate quotations. And for some of them, I'll pull out the book because I have it and I look to the page number and I'll say, oh, well, it's not on that page. And it said, oh, well, it's not really in that book, but but that quote is really a sort of an amalgamation that aligns with like what that person feels. And I said, oh, well, okay, but that's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an exact quotation. So what you'll find in some of these tools is it will direct you broadly to a piece of work. I've tried to have at least direct you broadly to a piece of work, but it won't provide an exact quotation. And perhaps I admit part of that is me being a stickler for really wanting to be accurate with quotations. And I just don't want to steer anyone in the wrong way. So one of the tools we're looking at this evening is depending on how you like to preach, I love preaching the Lowry Loop. It's one of my favorite methods of preaching, and you can learn a little more about the Lowry Loop if you want to. But one of the first tools that we have is this Lowry Loop generator, which is a more narrative form of sermon writing or giving a sermon, where you start, is there anyone here who's familiar with the Lowry Loop? Okay. Well, that must have been when I went through seminary. It was the popular one. So I encourage you to check it out. It still might be an interesting tool for you. But I'm going to show, though, for example, you can see sort of the goals that it has there to help create a sermon outline for you in this style of a narrative sermon. To provide that kind of structure and clarity, trying to even touch on some exegesis points, theological insights, and supporting the kind of writing that you want. But you can see here, if I just go in, and I can try and zoom in for folks, if I ask it to just generate an outline for this text of John 18, part of what it will do, this sermon generator, it will give you some possible sermon titles if you need help, as I usually do, creating sermon titles for my sermon. And then it will walk you through what it thinks is a good sermon based on the Lowry Loop format. So in this case, it's, how in this text would you explore upsetting the status quo, analyzing the conflict that's going on, disclosing a clue to the resolution, experiencing the gospel, and anticipating consequences, which is a part of the Lowry Loop sermon. But if you spend some time, and you could spend some time playing around this with yourself, as you see, if I just give it this simple text to work with, it's not going to perhaps generate the most cohesive sermon outline, and it's also not going to generate something that probably is something I'm going to want to preach. But if I spend some time uploading, in this scenario, the same model, but I uploaded actually a Word document that had like 3 pages worth of notes that I had, it will spend some time then actually diving a lot deeper into the notes that I already had, organizing it into a cohesive sermon outline, and helping to flush out even some of the transitional points that I might have in my notes. And you can see here in this case, like, it starts picking up on some of the exegesis points that I already had in my sermon prep notes, of something and ways that I can work that into the sermon. If you perhaps were in the sermon writing class as a lay preacher that Carol and I taught, I'm looking at Jim because that would be you. You would be familiar with the 4-page sermon outline. And again, just a different style of sermon writing outline. But this too, again, like all the tools, depending on what you put into it, the result will vary greatly. So I think that's something we discover with AI like ChatGPT is it's not that kind of like magic wand that we can just turn to spit out a sermon and expect it to generate something good. So in this case, it will generate a pretty detailed sermon outline based on the work I've already done based on the 4-page sermon writing outline. For those of you who do preach on a more regular basis, perhaps you would be interested in this tool. I spent some time working on a word study tool, which will help you unpack the biblical language. Perhaps if you have some interesting insights or some other thoughts that you want to really pull out from the text, I worked on a word study tool for you. And in this case, in the word study tool, I'm asking it, I'm actually preaching on this text this Sunday from Luke. And so, I gave it the main idea of what I'm looking for from this passage from Luke. And I say, I give it a little bit of a main idea of what I'm trying to look for in this sermon in terms of what I sort of want to hone in on. And so you see in this word study tool, it helps pick out what I want in terms of helping to pick out words that I might be really interested in my sermon, especially since I focus on listening. It's going to pick up on some of the Greek words and even connect it to some other passages of scripture that are similar to that. It will offer, again, some key insights that might be useful for the sermon that I want to give on Sunday. And then it'll walk through a couple other pieces that help you reflect a little more deeply about the passage. And perhaps you might want to expand that out into more of your exegetical work. I should say for this sermon word study tool, this has been trained on publicly available Greek and Hebrew versions of scripture, in addition to concordance, publicly available concordance information out there also. So it's why it will allow you to dive a little more deeply into word study versus just relying on it to pull from somewhere on the internet in terms of the word study that it gets you. And then perhaps if you're like me, the final tool that I have this evening, because it's my least favorite part of the sermon writing process, is a sermon editor. I hate grammar. And they told me in seminary Greek would be easy because it's like English grammar. And I was like, well, I'm already bad at English grammar. So I'm not sure how much better I'll be at Greek. So this helps you, again, trained publicly available information on grammar and things like that. It's meant to help retain your original style and voice that you have in your writing, but to really smooth out the rough edges, perhaps in your sermon writing manuscript. If you share your manuscripts, for myself, I publish them on my personal website, but even for yourself, it just might be something that you like to have a polished and edited sermon manuscript. And something like this, if I give it a paragraph for it to edit, it's programmed to produce the polished text, and then it'll even walk me through the changes that it made and why it made those changes if I'm really interested in that. So these are all tools that will be available to you, and they're free since you can use ChatGPT for free. But I think some of the pieces for ChatGPT, as I mentioned, depending on where you are in your level of comfort with technology, is you can mess around with making your own custom program. I think the purpose of that would be so you're not starting from scratch every time you're interfacing with ChatGPT. It's sort of already a base to start from. I think the example that I'll give you is I, for example, have a custom sermon editor that I trained on the last 4 years of my sermons. So it knows my general style, it knows my general tone of voice. So if I ask it to, if I put in a sermon manuscript that I recently wrote and I say, edit this, it will pretty closely edit the sermon manuscript in my style and my voice, which is something I think that's helpful. So you can program it to do whatever you want. Again, the quality of input in terms of the language that you use to craft it will vary, will change the results it produces. But if you want to dive deeper, if you ever get to that point of wanting to dive deeper into making your own, that does require a subscription through OpenAI and through ChatGPT.
And this is the third level of subscription you're describing here as Pro.
I think it should be the second level, or the basic level subscription for ChatGPT. Yeah.
Have you developed all of these tools? Or these that you like the word study? You've developed all of those?
Yeah. Yeah. And so like, so like the Lowry loop one, I could show you on the back end if you're really curious. So, I have a Word document that tells you like what the Lowry loop is, for example. So it knows all the stages of the Lowry loop. And I tell it what I want it to do. So I have it pretend that it's a copywriter or some kind of editor who helps you develop an outline based on what you put into it. And because I am sensitive about who uses our programs, I do have some guidelines that I put into it. So I don't want people using my tool to write something that's hateful or hurtful or harmful. So if you do ask it to generate something like that, it's going to very kindly tell you, I can't do that for you. But then, I could tell it also, if I have a preference, for example, for not using gendered language for God, I can also tell it to not try to use gendered language for God if I don't want it to. And then you can see here, I could tell it to, format the response in the way that I want it to be formatted. So it tries to provide you a consistent outline each and every time you use it. And you can see, like, I tell it don't provide quotes because you sometimes hallucinate, but you can give them a general idea of where you're pulling from. But the nice thing of making something like this from scratch is that it creates that base point for you. So if you wanted something a lot more personalized for you, for example, in terms of how you write a sermon, it's not like you're starting from a blank slate each time. But at least if you use one of these tools that I've made, you already have at least a pretty good starting point. I've used these tools, played around with them, and I've been pretty happy with the kind of results that it's produced. So I just want to. Oh yeah, David.
So Lowry loop is a known technique or style of writing sermons, and you mentioned seminary, and then you've took that and put it into Chat GPT and created a tool that follows that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I typed out a Word document that in detail laid out what the Lowry loop was and what each of the stages were. And so when you feed it a detailed, when you give it a good input, it will give you a pretty detailed outline based on that information I've already fed it on what the Lowry loop is.
And the 4-page sermon is the same thing, the same
Yep.
idea. That's another known
Yeah.
outline of how to write a sermon, and you just put it into Chat GPT.
Yep. Yeah. So both of those programs already have a solid foundation for if you're just looking for a detailed sermon outline based on work you've done. And then the one for the word study, for example, is similar, like I said, except I didn't type it all out, but it's publicly available data for, a Greek version of the New Testament and a Hebrew version of the Old Testament, and the appropriate concordances that go with it to help you dive deeper into the text that you're looking for. So if you typed in that you were looking for something, it would help you do a nice word study of that passage.
And so I have started to use ChatGPT myself for like the last year. I
Yeah.
started a very little bit, and I had a lot of guilt about it, like I was cheating somehow, and been doing been doing more and more. And but I have gotten pretty good results without the tool, using like manually doing what you're doing. I put in a couple of texts, I put in language that I want to use. This is what I want to say. These are my ideas. and then I work with it, and then it questions me. But you think that these tools you have probably will give me superior results to that than to kind of building it as I go along. Or
That's
maybe
my personal experience, especially for the outline generators. If you already do some stream of consciousness thought in a Word document and you wanted to upload it, then like you already spent time thinking about the passage, or you've already done some work looking at the words. If you then take all that sort of what you think is a jumbled mess of a Word document and feed it into one of these sermon outline generators, it'll do a pretty good job of taking what thoughts you already had and organizing them into a pretty good cohesive sermon outline that you could flush out into a fuller manuscript if you wanted to.
Thank you.
Casey?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I just, wanted to, especially to David, feeling about the guilt feeling. And for, people who are a real baseline lay preacher, such as myself, I had recently come up with a premise, given the situation in our congregation, and, I had an idea that I wanted to test the waters of how our congregation were feeling about an unfortunate change that we had, but then realizing that we had to move forward following the disappointment. So I had the idea of how to move forward following disappointment, and I threw that into ChatGPT, and it gave me a great outline. And then my very tech-savvy daughter helped me figure out how to present the questions. As Casey said earlier, the more you give it, the more you'll get back. So Kate had thrown in a phrase and came back with several pages, including Bible verses. And then I reworded it a little more specifically to our situation. And then she said, well, then just Frankenstein it. So, of course, David, that's where the guilt feeling, like, all right. Somebody eventually pointed out to me that, well, you did edit it yourself, so it wasn't totally AI.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into, I think, what I want to talk about next is the ethical questions as we think about AI and sermon writing. It is this still new thing. It's this thing that's rapidly evolving. And I think sort of what you said, David, I myself have really not started using AI in terms of how I write sermons since the beginning of this year is when I started really heavily exploring what these tools can do. And so I think there's 5 sort of questions or 5 considerations that we can ask ourselves to help set the boundaries for ourselves in terms of how we think about the ethics of using AI in sermon writing. I think part of that is setting your boundaries. I think you need to spend time thinking what you are and what you're not comfortable with in terms of AI and sermon writing in the process. For example, if you're going to spend time or if you think that, asking ChatGPT to write out paragraphs for you for a sermon that you use, and you feel like that's not something that is good for you ethically, I think you need to spend time, or we all need to spend time really setting those kind of ethical boundaries in terms of how we use this technology. I think that sort of plays into my real belief of this is a tool and it's not a magic wand. I think you can ask ChatGPT to write a sermon for you, a full sermon without any real extra input from you. But I think it's going to be a pretty mediocre sermon, quite honestly. I've tried my best to have it generate a sermon just to see the quality. And yeah, it might have read something more like my first year of seminary than where I'm at now. And my first year in seminary were not good sermons. But it's a tool. And I think the tool, again, based on how we practice using it and how we, think about what we're feeding into it, I think we realize then that there's still a lot of the core spirit work of the sermon writing process that's still, up for us to do. Which I think that leads into the next consideration of the context. sort of also what Jim was hinting at is, AI is very good at generalizations, but it doesn't know your people. It doesn't know the people in your congregation. It doesn't know what they're going through. So, you can ask it to produce a sermon, you could ask it to produce an outline, but it won't know all the nuances of what's going on in your congregation. That's only something you know as the preacher. And so I think that's something important for us to consider as we think about the use of AI. The other is the pastoral voice. Again, I don't think ChatGPT on its own has a very good pastoral voice, but I think the stories and the voices that you have and you as a preacher up there in the pulpit is something that ChatGPT won't ever be able to fully capture. And so, whether you want to use ChatGPT as a tool to help you get started on your sermon writing process, and then you spend time editing and flushing out what these ideas looks like, I think that's great. I think it's just realizing, though, that again, going back to the other consideration, that it's a tool that should help amplify the kind of pastoral or prophetic voice that you have, and it shouldn't be something that erases it. I think the last thing also then for us to consider is that, this is a spirit-led process, sermon writing, this mysterious, wonderful, frustrating thing we call sermon writing. And it's not something that I think a sophisticated algorithm will ever be able to replace. And so the kind of work that you spend in doing a word study or spending time meditating on the text before you craft a sermon, again, I think it goes back to it being a spirit-led process, and this is just another tool to help you along the way of doing that. So, what kind of questions do you have, friends, or are there tools for sermon writing that you would find interesting that existed out there that perhaps I might want to wade into and see if I can cook something up in the AI kitchen?